And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am Hank Garner, your host, as always. Today, I'm super excited to have Deborah Crombie on the show with me. She has a brand new book, and today is release day for it. It's A Killing of Innocence. Is it the 19th
It is the
book in the
19th.
series?
Trying to not get my hands in front of the cover here. There we
Yeah,
go. That's
I know.
good.
What a phenomenal cover. The Duncan
It is
Kincaid and
gorgeous, isn't it? I love
Yes,
it.
it
I
is. It
think they
is.
did a terrific job on this
I know. I
with
love it.
a little
Uh,
input from me.
Yeah. The Duncan Kincaid, Gemma James series. This is book 19. How
It
many years
is.
have you been writing this series, Deborah?
Well, actually, last Friday, I think, was the 30th anniversary of the publication of my first book. It's like, how did
Wow.
this even happen? I don't, I don't know. I couldn't have imagined. Of course, it should be 30 books if I wrote faster, but
Well, we're happy to have what we have. Um, Deborah, before we get into talking about it, I have a question that I've been asking people lately, and it's been a lot of fun to get people's responses. But is there a piece of writing advice that you got somewhere along your journey, before you were published or afterwards or whatever, that has stuck with you? And maybe you think, wow, that was such a great piece of advice. I'm so glad I've held on to it. Or and maybe it's both, or do you have a piece of advice that was so horrible, you just think, why would anyone share that with someone else? Do you have a piece that stands out in your mind?
well, I have a couple. Actually, I took, after I graduated from college, I took a continuing education type creative writing course, and the instructor basically told me that I should give up, that I was terrible and was never going to write anything worth reading. And I didn't try writing anything again for about 10 years after that. So it's not the kind of advice you should give people. It's really not.
No.
Um, so, and but my favorite positive adage, I think,
Yeah.
was Nora Roberts. Bad pages are better than no pages.
Yeah.
And I have written that down and stuck it to the top of my laptop because it just you got to get in the chair and put something on the page.
Oh, and I don't know about you, Deborah, but I've had times like that where I have felt that the the pages I was writing were just trite and they were terrible and no one's ever going to want to read this. And that advice of knowing, well, at least I can go back later and edit it. And I can come back to it when I'm in a different
Yeah.
mindset, when I have a different perspective, and at least I can manipulate, the one good idea that I had on this page. But what I found out is that when I go back, it's rarely as terrible as I think it is in the
Yeah,
moment.
yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah, that I don't know
and at
what it
least
is.
it gives you a jumping off point.
Yeah, and it's so weird that our minds play these tricks on us, that you're no good, nothing you create will ever be good enough, and looking back, it's always different. It's always different. Um, after that piece of terrible advice that you got, and then you said you didn't write anything for 10 years after that. What was the motivation to give it a crack again?
Well, and at the time I had I'd written poetry since I was about 14.
Yeah,
And and I had written some little sort of literary leaning short stories and submitted them and never had
yeah,
any success with those. But I hadn't actually tried to write a novel. And I don't think I had ever really contemplated writing a novel. And this is a little bit of a long story that we might get to from other angles, but I
yeah.
had lived in Scotland and England and come back to the States, and I was just desperately homesick for England. And I was over there on a trip with my Scottish now ex-husband, And we were in Yorkshire, and we saw somewhere on the roads, the Yorkshire moors, we saw a Georgian house that had been converted to timeshares. And I said, can we go in and, oops, sorry, I forgot to silence the
That's
phone.
fine.
There we go. And I thought, wouldn't that make a great setting for a sort of, contemporary country house mystery?
Right.
And I took off from there, and I came up with my detectives, and I had the bones of a plot, and I started writing, and I was just absolutely determined to write a novel. In spite of the fact that lots of people made fun of me, it might be a good idea to tell aspiring writers that don't tell a lot of people that you're writing a book. Just do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless you find like-minded people who are also working on writing books.
Yeah. Well, writing that first book is one thing entirely. And, Stephen King in his book On Writing talks about writing with the door closed, at least that first draft.
Yeah.
Whatever your process for sharing with the beta readers or, trusted confidants, for that next draft or whatever. That's a one thing. But keeping that first one sacred is really important, especially if it's your first novel.
Yes. Yes. And I did eventually. I took writing courses,
Yeah.
and went to some conferences, and I did eventually end up in a writers group, but we had all taken the same writing course. So we knew that we were all working from the same parameters in our criticism, which is really helpful because I think writing groups can be dangerous,
Yeah.
because a lot of people don't know how to criticize helpfully and what sort of things to criticize that would be helpful.
Right.
So it was really great that we were all on the same page.
Yeah, and some people just don't understand what you're trying to do. There's having a specific audience early in the process is really important. That people that get what you're trying to do and understand is very helpful for sure. You said that you wrote poetry early on and some short stories, but had never tried your hand at writing a novel. When you began writing that first novel, what was the difference for you in form over writing poetry, which is a form all its own, and short stories, which tend to be more compact and you know get to the point or no subplots and that sort of thing. When you started kind of letting um your creative juices flow and kind of really feeling the spread out nature of a novel, what was that experience like for you?
Well, I just think in novel form, sort of long form, and
Yeah.
I'm terrible at short stories. I can't write them. Every time I come up with what I think is an idea for a short story, it turns into a novel. So, I always want all those details, and I want to know about all the different characters, and so I think short stories are just really not my forte. I don't know. I loved traditional British detective novels,
Yeah.
and it was something about that form just really appealed to me. I was actually a big fantasy and science fiction fan.
Yeah.
I'm still really like to read fantasy, urban fantasy, not so much, dragons sort of
Right.
fantasy, but stuff with magic. But
Sure.
I never came up with any idea for a plot or world building. So my brain apparently just doesn't work that way either. But I really like crime novels. I like the structure of the crime novel. I came up with the writing in multiple viewpoints, which seems to work really well for me.
Yeah.
I've never written anything in first person, single viewpoint. except for, a few little bits of things here and there. And it was fun, but I think the multiple viewpoint format really works.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely working for your series, that's for sure. You said that you were always a fan of the British mystery novel. For people that are not familiar, what distinguishes a British detective novel from like an American gumshoe novel, if you think in those terms, or a modern mystery like um I'm completely drawing a blank now. But like any particular American mystery writer, what like the Longmire mysteries, for instance, what separates a British mystery from a quintessential American mystery?
I don't think the distinction is as valid as it used to be.
Okay.
I mean, people are writing British detective novels these days that are gritty.
Yeah.
Um, and they can be very dark. I it, I think that it used to be assumed that British detective novels were sort of more civil and less violent, and I'm
Is
actually
that kind of
not
where
even.
our cozy mystery
Yeah, yeah, and I'm
comes
not even
from?
sure that that was ever true.
Yeah.
If you go back, I'm listening to on Audible. I'm listening to Lucy Worsley's biography of Agatha Christie, which is really interesting. But if you go
Yeah.
back and look, even at Christie, some of her crimes were horrible.
Yeah.
And children killed people. People assume. I think people who assume that they're very cozy have never actually, really read Christie.
Right.
um,
It's
so if
more
you look
our
at,
assumptions that we bring to the book more than the books
yeah, you look
themselves.
at people like Patricia Highsmith and Ruth Rendell, and these sort of classics of British mystery and suspense, and even P.D. James, because I was a big fan of P.D. James and did a lot of sort of mirroring of P.D. James books when I first started writing. I mean, looking at how she structured things. But hers are actually quite dark. So I think the whole thing is a little bit blown out of proportion, and a lot of it is just setting. They're they just feel quite different in setting.
Yeah. Um, that first novel that you wrote, was that, a Duncan Kincaid
Yes,
and Gemma
yeah,
James
yeah,
novel?
they're all in the same series. That was A Share in Death, published in February 1993 and still in print.
I love it, I love it. I've talked to a lot of authors who, and it's a very common occurrence that authors will have a novel or more, that resides in a desk drawer or a trunk, as we used to call them, trunk novels. And it's a rarity that someone who writes their first novel, um, sticks with that novel until it's published. And people, start new novels for a host of reasons. But, what is it that you can put your finger on that just felt special about that novel, that you knew that it was gonna go the distance?
I loved my characters. I loved
That's
the
important.
the setup and the world, and um, the specific world building for that book.
Yeah.
And I thought it had huge potential in order to introduce new characters, use different settings. And I think that's why I've never gotten tired of it, because I have taken them to different places, and the characters have grown and changed, and other characters have come into the series. Um, so, and I loved the process of writing it. I can remember my ex-husband asked me at some point, said, "Well, what are you going to do if you don't sell this book?" And I said, "I'm going to write another one." And when I sold Share and Death, I had already started on the second book in the series, All Should Be Well. And I knew I wanted to write series novels.
That's an important distinction. You started writing the second book in the series, not
Yes.
another book with different characters, and you knew that these were the characters for you.
Yeah, and
I
I
love that.
very, very much wanted to write a series, and actually that was one of the things that sold the first book. I sold that first book within 6 months of finishing it. I never had a rejection letter. I sold the first
Wow.
3 books under contract to Scribner. But one of the things that helped make that sale was the fact that I had the second one partly written, and I had a proposal for the third one.
Wow.
So,
Wow. When it's a very different thing in writing a first book in a series where the there are no limits because you haven't created the thing yet, and writing the 19th book in a series where you have an established world, you have an established order and structure to these characters' lives and the things going on. So maybe this question maybe comes in two parts, but when you're thinking of a new book, what comes to you first? Is it a new plot that you're going to introduce these characters to, and does the mystery come first? And what was the first thing that came to you in that first book where you had no history for these characters?
oh, that one was absolutely the setting. And
Mm,
then I created the detectives in order to use the setting.
gotcha.
But s- after that, it's been sort of uh, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? It's
Yeah,
usually a combination. Usually, I have a setting in mind that I would like to explore in a book, and I have ideas about what is going on in the continuing characters' lives that I and then I see how that could fit into the specific crime story, but it kind of all goes on at once.
gotcha. Um, what makes a good mystery? Like when you're thinking of a new book and you're thinking of something um to put in your character's path, and there's a mystery to solve, there's a riddle to unravel. um w- how do you start thinking about those mysteries, and do you start thinking about the question, or do you think about it in terms of here's a mystery and here's how I would solve it, or do you know the solution to it?
I usually do. I don't think I've ever written a novel where I didn't have an idea where I wanted the story to end up. And I have lots of writer friends who are pantsters
Yeah.
who say, they just get an idea for a situation and they start writing and they don't know who did it or how the story is going to end up. And I can't imagine doing that. I mean, I am not an obsessive plotter. I don't sit down and plot out every bit of the book before I start writing it. Um, but I do like to have a lodestone. My big question and what tends to bog me down sometimes in the middle is figuring out what logical ways it will play out so that my detectives figure out what happened in a reasonable and believable way. And I don't always know how that's going to happen or if it will, which is the really scary part.
I bet. I bet.
There's been lots of books where in the middle I've said, "Oh my God, I don't think this is going to work. How am I going to do this?"
Yeah. With 19 books in a series, is there ever a time where a book is driven more by what's going on in the character's life than it is about a mystery that is placed in front of them or a crime to solve? How often have the books really taken on the the character's journey more than the crime?
Oh, again, that's tough. That's, you know,
And kind of get intertwined in a lot of
but
ways,
yeah,
don't they?
they're so intertwined, and
Yeah.
I don't think, at least at this point in the series, I don't I can't imagine writing a novel, and obviously you want the books to be accessible to people who haven't read previous books in the series.
Right,
So you want
right,
somebody to be able to pick up A Killing of Innocence and start reading and have enough clues as to what is going on with the characters to not feel lost.
sure.
But there has to be some sort of forward movement or evolution in the character's ongoing story, I think. So I can't imagine writing a personally static novel from my characters' viewpoints. And I'm usually setting things up a book or two in advance where I kind of know what I want to have happen in the next book or the book after that. So
Yeah. With a series that spans 30 years, a lot has changed in the
the floating
world and the technology of
the floating
mystery.
timeline.
Yeah, so many books, so many traditional mysteries could be solved just, by a cell phone. He just
Yeah.
picked up the phone and he called for help. Um, how do you keep up one with w- with the advances in technology, and has technology caused you to think differently about the way we handle these plots?
Oh, that's interesting. Um, I've always wanted to write novels where the detectives solve the crime through deduction.
Mhm.
And although actually my background is in biology, and even after when I first started writing, I took a forensics course because I was fascinated by the science of it, which is still true. But I've never wanted my characters to solve the mysteries using technology. And sometimes it's in a with advances in technology, I think it gets harder and harder to write around. One of the things I think I tend to do is to really compress the timeline so that investigations happen really quickly, much
Yeah.
more quickly than they probably would in real life. But this is fiction. Nobody, for instance, in A Killing of Innocence, I got like half a dozen detectives who are working on this case. In real life, it would probably be 60. But you can't write that. You
Right,
have to make adjustments that will make it manageable while still keeping it believable.
right.
I try to work around CCTV cameras, for instance.
Yeah.
And when they come to a resolution of the story, I usually try to have worked in forensics or video or something that will help back up the case when it goes to court. But I don't want that to be how the case is solved.
Yeah.
Does that answer that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Have you had an opportunity to use modern technology to your advantage? Like,
Oh,
the ubiquity of cell phones and social media, has that played into, how you solve a mystery?
I got to think about that. Not I mean, they do use social media. For
Mhm.
instance, in A Killing of Innocence, they look up the characters'
Right,
social media, because it's just a part of life now. So
right.
of course they would do that, but I don't think I've really used it to help solve a crime.
Yeah. Um,
Again, I feel like that's kind of cheating. Uh,
yeah, yeah. When you began writing the series, as you said earlier, you were living in Scotland, but
had lived in
you
Scotland,
yeah,
yeah,
you
and England.
yeah, and you don't live there now, though, right? Aren't you in
No,
Texas?
I'm in Texas, and I'm a native Texan, as you might have guessed from the
Yeah,
accent.
yeah. How do you stay connected to another country, while writing about that other country, living here in America? Does that pose any challenges?
Well, normally I spend at least a month out of the year in the UK, and sometimes I make more than one trip and, spend more time than that. And have ever since I started writing this series. And what happened with the Killing of Innocents, and people will notice that there was a longer than usual gap here
Yeah.
between books. But I had started the research for this book in London in October, November of 2019. And we all know what happened. I mean, I had planned to go back in the spring and, again in the fall of 2020. And I couldn't go. And it was tough. I mean, I was writing about a part of London that I know, but that is not the same as actually
Right.
being there and walking the streets and going into the places that, or the locations, the settings in the book. And it was just really, really tough. And I bogged down horribly. And I just sort of had to pull myself up by bootstraps and
Yeah.
say, okay, this is not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to go to London, and I just have to do the best I can. And I spent so much time on Google Street View.
I was about to ask you what things you used as
I
a
don't know. I
substitute.
don't know how I could have written this book without current technology. I mean, I literally walked the streets with
Oh,
Google
that's
Street View,
fantastic.
and of course, use internet to research all sorts of places. And
Yeah.
and what was really strange when we got to the copy edit and the page proof stage on this book, that I would read passages and I would have to think for a minute about whether that was someplace that I had actually been in person or whether it was someplace that I had just been on Google.
Oh, wow. So are there things that you started to use then that have kind of become part of your writing or researching process now that,
Well,
did you
I
add
was
any tools to
yeah,
your toolkit?
I was already doing a lot of research on the internet, but just as in addition to what I would do in real life. So I wasn't so much bringing in new technology as just really learning to take better advantage
Yeah,
of what was available.
yeah. Over 19 books, has your writing process changed, or your planning, plotting process? Do you write books differently now than you did then, other than, your the computer technology has, progressed and things like that, but do you
Yes,
think
word
about
perfect.
stories differently?
We all remember word perfect.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, interesting, interestingly, not really. A couple of years ago, the University of North Texas, here, sorry, because they have my manuscripts and materials for their library, they did an exhibition with my notes and editing process from the very first book. And I was shocked at how similar it was to what I
Wow.
still do. I tend to start out with a basic idea for the book, and then I tend to have storylines where I will have maybe half a dozen major storylines in each
Mhm.
book that I know that that's what I want to write about, and I will take each storyline and start it like bullet points with where we start in the story and what has to happen at the end of this story, and then what incidents have to happen to move it from here to here, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Right.
And then I try to and I do that for every storyline, and then I try to interlace the different storylines. And some books are a lot more complicated than others because I have books that have had historical storylines that have had to be worked into the contemporary storyline. And but my process is still pretty much the same.
Interesting. Um, Deborah, what makes a great mystery? Is it the mechanical, solving the puzzle, or or is a great mystery more about the people and the way they behave around a mysterious occurrence? What is
Mm,
the most fun?
I think it's the psychological impact that the crime has on not only the detectives, but the people who are directly affected by the crime in the story. I've always been fascinated on how it affects these violent and unexpected acts affect ordinary people, because most of my characters are ordinary. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like did this happen to you or me or your neighbor down the street? And also really interested in what makes ordinary people do such an extraordinary thing. I mean, most of us think we wouldn't be driven to murder.
yeah,
Um, but what would be the tipping point? So that's always really, really interesting to me and part of the psychology. And of course, we want a puzzle,
yeah,
and that's part of that moves the plot.
yeah,
We have to have that plot tension, and we want a resolution. And one of the things I think makes mysteries, traditional mysteries in particular, so satisfying for readers is that we have a sense that justice is done. And I think especially in the last couple of years, because we have all felt like life was so out of our control,
mm,
and that so many bad things were happening that we couldn't do anything about,
yeah.
that justice wouldn't be done. So I think it's very satisfying and comforting to people to read a novel where there are consequences.
Yeah. Well, I think the best mysteries, the ones that hit the hardest, don't involve superheroes, and the
No.
villains are rarely mustache twirling supervillains. That a lot of times it's people that are driven or pushed to a point, and then regular people that have to, uh, you know, see that justice is done. Those are the ones that tend to stick with us.
Well, and I think it has to have consequences. I think your reader needs to have empathy for the characters in the book, and
Yeah,
whether or not the murder, the crime is resolved has to have consequences for the characters in the book, that so that the reader is emotionally invested in the outcome.
yeah, yeah, I agree. The new book is called A Killing of Innocence, and it's available everywhere today. You can go to
Everywhere.
your favorite bookstore, grab it off the shelf, or we'll put links in the show notes where you can grab it in Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobook. Deborah, have you listened to any of the audiobook?
Oh no, I waited. I was up until like 1 last night waiting for the audiobook to drop, and it
Yeah.
didn't.
Oh.
So it is available. I don't know why they didn't release it at midnight my time zone, but and the Kindle dropped.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I
Yeah.
pulled up the Kindle and started reading it last night, but the audio is available today. So I haven't had a chance to listen to any of it yet, but I had last week, I think, an audio sample on SoundCloud, and I love my narrator. Gerard Doyle is just fabulous. He reads Duncan and Gemma the way I hear them in my head, which I just think
Love it.
is extraordinary.
Absolutely.
And I listened to that first little sample on SoundCloud, and I literally got goosebumps. So I
That's
can't
the
wait to
best.
listen to it. I can't wait for other people to listen to it.
I know it's downloaded in my Audible app. I read the hardcover, uh, you know, a month ago. But I can't wait. It's a whole new experience when you
It
get to
is. It's
relive the
weird for
audiobook.
me, yeah, 'cause when I listen to the audiobooks, it is like I didn't write it. Yeah.
Right. It's wild. It's wild.
Yeah.
A Killing of Innocence available everywhere now. Go out and grab it. Deborah, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show with me
Thank you,
today.
Hank.